So, and now over to Oisín, who's Director of Friends of the Earth Ireland.
Thanks, Siobhán. First of all, I'd like to thank the organisers very much for inviting me, specifically, or especially rather, as I'm a bit of an interloper. I'm not an academic, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to talk about adaptation, because Doug's going to talk about that. And probably the only migration I'll talk about is what happens if Phil Hogan goes to Brussels in a couple of weeks. Having said that, we do work very much on climate justice, and I'm going to talk about the Irish climate legislation, and to some degree it very much relates to that issue of linking global and local initiatives, which is part of the title of this seminar. Partly because often when we've been pushing for legislation that enshrines Ireland's targets in domestic law, we've been told, well, we don't really need it because we have EU law that governs Ireland's obligations, and we're legally bound to meet our targets that way, which is true, but that hasn't actually happened. And our Kyoto targets were legally binding under the Kyoto Protocol, and we were on target to more than double the increase we were allowed under Kyoto until the crash came. So we weren't going to meet those. And we're already off track on our more legally binding EU targets. We're not off track yet, but we will overshoot them. We're off track now. We'll overshoot them in 2015, 2016. So international law and European law on its own has not been enough to instigate adequate action in Ireland on climate change. And if the fuss there was, which I'll mention briefly, about the first attempt to put climate change law into law in Ireland at the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, is anything to go by. If it proves anything, it proves that we take, as Irish people, as Irish society, as Irish stakeholders, we take domestic law more seriously than we take European law, because people reacted to what was essentially putting into place our European targets into Irish law as if it was something new and different and going to upturn everything we'd ever held dear. So that's the way the point of that is the link between local and global. And equally, we often say, well, we can't be going ahead of international targets, even though we're not really being asked to in the current versions of the law. We have to wait and see what our international obligations are, and then we'll implement them here. Or if we do have law, it'll only be to implement targets we might have in the future. Whereas in fact, Cristina Figueres, who's the General Secretary or Secretary General of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and therefore in charge of the negotiations to get us a new treaty in Paris, she very much says now more and more that actually we need the domestic law first, that we won't get a deal in Paris unless, and she's been going around the world talking to legislators saying, you need to take action now in your parliaments so that when your heads of government get to Paris, or whoever goes to Paris, if it's energy or environment ministers, or whether we let the heads of government loose again like we did in Copenhagen, they need to have a domestic mandate and a domestic platform, something that they can bring to the table. So that is very much how I see climate legislation, Irish climate legislation, linking the local and the global initiatives around climate change. So what I'm going to talk about in my time is a bit about the process, just to remind those who haven't been paying attention every week to the long, painful process of climate legislation to where we are now, but more, I hope, on the content compared to, obviously, we've touched on the fact that there's a law in Scotland, there's a law in the UK, there are now laws happening it's passed in Denmark and coming in Finland now. So compared to what climate change law should look like, what the Irish versions have looked like so far. A little bit about the politics of it, but it is a law seminar, so I don't need a little bit about politics. And then what happens next? On the process, I started this job in February 2005, and one of the first things I did was to go over to the UK, to London, to meet the guys from Friends of the Earth, England, Wales and Northern Ireland, to ask to see how they did it with 130 staff, so I could replicate that with one staff here. And they said, we're going to launch a new campaign in May, this is a month before that, and it's going to be it's going to be for a climate change law, to put UK's targets into law. And I remember my first reaction was, why are you going to do that? Or more to the point, why would any government do that? Why would they tie their hands in advance of negotiations, in advance of, why aren't you focusing on maybe a carbon tax, some of the actual tools? And they were saying, no, we think the time is right, we're going to do it, it'll have long-term consequences, it's the right thing to do. And they were absolutely right in their analysis. They were also transpires right analysis in terms of its potential impact or its potential usefulness. But it transpires they were right in terms of the conjuncture they had in the UK at the time. It transpires, though, because they had it passed by November 2008 with a large coalition behind them at that stage. Now, it transpires there was a particular moment in the UK with the Conservatives trying to position themselves as green and not nasty anymore, hugging hoodies and going to the Arctic and vote blue, go green, and so on. So they had an easy opposition to work with, and then the Labour government not wanting to be outflanked. And that conjuncture hasn't been replicated elsewhere. It was just after Stern, it was after the Al Gore movie, it was after the IPCC report last time, it was at the end of a long boom before a crash, so things haven't been the same since. But we took up that baton here in April 2007, launching a campaign for climate law. And weirdly, on the same day, the Labour Party launched a blueprint for a low-carbon Ireland that included a commitment to a climate change law. And very quickly, just to bring in the climate justice element immediately, or what I would see as the climate justice element, we very quickly formed a coalition with overseas aid agencies and others, youth agencies and faith groups and so on, because we saw as an environmental sector, associated mostly with purely environmental issues, although Friends of the Earth internationally would always bring a strong social justice element, given the majority of our members in the Federation are from the Global South. With the overseas aid agencies in Ireland, who also bring that Global South message and who have a much larger reach than the environmental organisations in Ireland. They're the biggest NGOs in the country, Concern, Trócaire, Oxfam, Quiroz-Onate, have a household name, status and resonance. So we very quickly collaborated with them, and very quickly we're using a climate justice narrative or frame, and because of the fact, one of the things that struck me most when I started this job, I came from an overseas aid job in Christian aid, is that we're very proud of being the 6th most generous country in the world in overseas aid, and very few people knew, I didn't know before I started this job, that we were the 6th most polluting country in the world when it came to climate pollution. I should say inside the OECD, so the comparison countries. Anyway, in the 2007 election, only the Labour Party had a climate change bill in their manifesto. The Greens didn't, and I never quite got to the bottom of why that was. Because they didn't, when they went into government, it wasn't in the programme for government. But the campaign built over time, and in 2009, at the same point as we are now in the midterm of that government, they renegotiated the programme for government and they got the climate change bill in, because they had more leverage at that point than they had at the beginning. Also that year there was a business coalition formed, which Friends of the Earth was partly behind, with business in the community, a corporate leaders group on climate change, which was mirroring again an initiative in the UK. And very quickly after they got into the programme for government, the Greens delivered what you might call a white paper on climate change legislation. It wasn't called that, it was called a framework document, and they did that to have something to bring with them to Copenhagen. Then it went a bit quiet. In 2010, there was the rumblings of the financial crisis coming, but they also let the drop ball slip in terms of the politics of climate change. But they did eventually, a year later, deliver a bill at the end of 2010, and I'll come back to its content briefly, shortly. But the government collapsed in 2011 before they could get it through. It was being debated in the Seanad under pressure to be passed, but was being debated. However, there had been a lot of progress made in that Parliament, because all 6 parties, so including the Socialist Party and whatever the 6th one is, had an explicit commitment to climate change legislation in their manifestos or in their written statements before the 2011 election, compared to only 1 in 2007. So that was progress, and there had been good work done in an all-party committee in the Oireachtas during that time, and they'd produced a bill which the government hadn't taken up, which they should have done probably. So there was significant progress. And both Fine Gael and Labour therefore had it in their manifestos, and therefore it was easy enough for it to get into the programme for government, but it was very clear quickly enough that it wasn't a priority. Minister Hogan was saying when he got in it was a priority. He might even take the old opposition bill, send it to committee, because this new process they have now of sending heads of bill to a committee, which is a good process, before it goes to the Dáil for stakeholder consultation and less partisan analysis, for sure, than you get in the Dáil chamber. He was saying he'd do that, and he'd do it before the end of the year in 2011, and then the civil servants got their teeth into him. And instead he proposed a review of climate change policy, which was internal but no consultation, which, when it was published in November 2011, said actually we need to focus on policy and measures, and the climate legislation is not a priority. As it happened, one of the few times the Parliament has sort of stood up to the executive in this government, the Labour-led Oversight Committee for Environment said, hang on a second, we put this into the programme for government. It was both of them, but it was a Labour thing. You can't just do that. Called him in to clarify his timeline, and he agreed to them a roadmap for both policy and legislation in January 2012, which was supposed to deliver both a national action plan, we'll call it that, it has a different name, national action plan, by the end of last year, and legislation. So here we are, 2.5 years later, we still don't have either, but we do have some progress. The roadmap was actually not a bad document, and the process that delivered it, of him being under scrutiny and agreeing kind of live and spontaneously in a hearing that, okay, I'll do this deal with you, was a really good example of a parliamentary committee holding a minister to account, even though it was not an opposition, as very few are. It wasn't an opposition-led committee, but it was the junior coalition partner holding a senior coalition partner minister to account with colleagues in the committee. The roadmap included a public consultation, which they did in 2012, and in 2013 they produced their first draft heads. They were only draft heads, so heads of the outline of the bill. It was the draft heads of the outline of the bill. But then they did this really good process. They sent it to the Oireachtas Committee, which was going to be chaired by Kieran Lynch, who's now chairing the banking inquiry, and instead, because he moved up a notch, he was, after Roisin Shortall resigned, we had Michael McCarthy, who was newer to the topic, but in the end he didn't do a bad job at all as chair, and there were really good people on the committee from all the parties, really good stakeholders, about 40 submissions, and then 24 witnesses at hearings, 4 or 5 days, full days in the basement of Leinster House during the heatwave last year, but really good reasoned analysis, and they hired John Sweeney from NUI Maynooth to be the rapporteur for the committee. It's a very good process. They produced a report which couldn't have recommendations because that would be presumptuous, and I don't know why, but they couldn't. So they had suggestions on possible courses of actions that the minister might take, and I'm not making those words up. It went through various iterations. It got more and more watered down, not the content but the framing of it. That was November, and then the government then produced its revised heads of bill just April passed, and we're now waiting for the full parliamentary language bill, which Minister Hogan has said he'll have before the summer recess. Time is running out given the reshuffle on the 8th of July. And the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach and the Minister have all said they will pass it before the end of the year. Now, I've been wanting a climate change bill for Christmas for a long time now. We've used that slogan a few times because we often use the UN climate change talks as a hook for getting ministers to deliver. But we'll see. We're certainly getting there, but slowly. So that's the process. It's been long and to some degree, well, I was going to say painstaking, shall we say. But to talk more importantly about the content, it's not rocket science. It's not supposed to be a silver bullet. It's not supposed to. You can't, as has been pointed out, you can't actually reduce emissions by legislating for it. It's actually a policy architecture. It's about planning for. It's about consulting on. It's about transparency, and it's about accountability. That's what it is. It's a policy-making framework with targets. It's not the actual measures to deliver the reductions, but it's supposed to drive the process, because otherwise we know in this country and in many countries with the crash and everything else that climate change and all sorts of other issues fall off the agenda. Climate change is also an issue that, because the Environment Minister signs up to stuff, but to deliver it needs the Finance Minister, it needs the Roads Minister, it needs the Energy Minister, that it's an all-of-government undertaking to reduce emissions, so therefore a law is the best way to ensure all-of-government buy-in. It's also a long-term prospect, so a law is the best way to ensure one government to the next government continuity. And obviously you also want to build in, well, the things we see as being central to a Climate Change Act, very much taken from the UK and Scotland, 2008-2009 acts, are put your overall long-term target into law to drive stuff forward, to give a vision for where you want to get to, get expert advice from an independent body, adopt interim targets at a national level through your parliament to get all party buy-in, use that target as the basis for negotiation for your national action plan, negotiate which sectors, which is the big thing here, is it going to be agriculture, transport, energy, whatever it's going to be, negotiate that just like you negotiate a fiscal budget, negotiate a carbon budget for a 5-year period, get that number into Parliament and get the measures adopted, or at least laid out in a national action plan, or what was called until recently a national climate change strategy. Then have annual accountability to Parliament, which doesn't happen otherwise, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And use the independent body to report on progress and to empower Parliament in the way that the Controller and Auditor General's report empowers the committees in Parliament to hold ministers and General Secretaries to account for financial spending. An independent Climate Change Council can do that for Parliament on climate change. And finally, have the Minister give annual accountability to Parliament. So it's not rocket science, but it's extraordinary the level of resistance there's been in the civil service and among ministers, but civil service even more so possibly, to that over time. Now, I'll touch on that a little bit when I come to politics before the end. But to look then at the actual bills and how they measure up, because we've had, well, I'm going to ignore for now, I'm only going to look at the government bills and ignore the rake of opposition bills there were, which are much more based, and indeed all party bills, theoretically from the last Parliament, which were all very much based on the UK bill. But the ones the government actually brought forward, having been through the AG's office, the Attorney General's office, which makes a big difference. And there was one of the sort of, when committees produce bills, they don't go through the Attorney General's office, and therefore the government kind of dismisses them, because it's almost like, oh, you're just playing at being lawmakers. We have the civil service and we have the AG to stress test these bills that we produce, so yours aren't real. So we're not even going to. Having said to the committee, John Gormley said, we will introduce climate change bill when you all opposition come on board and come up with something. And a Labour-led opposition committee came up with an all-party bill, and then he said, oh, we're the government, so we do the legislation, you'll just have to keep talking among yourselves, which was really bad politics, and we would have got a lot further if he had taken on board their recommendations, but that's water under the bridge now. When they did come up with the bill at the end of 2010, it was quite good on targets, a bit confused about the 2020 target and made it look tougher than it was. It was basically the EU target that we had for 2020, but it had a 2030 target and a 2050 target of 80%, like the UK bill and other bills now. It was okay on an independent committee. Did have some ex officio members, but they were the SEAI and the EPA, so very relevant, energy and environment. It wasn't as independent as the UK committee, and it had this mad provision that it didn't have the right to publish its own reports. It could give its reports to government, and if and when government felt, if appropriate, they could publish the bill. And the Greens at the time shrugged their shoulders at us and said, I know, we haven't won that one. And that was pure civil service resistance, because they didn't want independent oversight, and they want the government to be able to publish the bill, publish the advice when they've made the decision, which is the classic government example, not 6 months in advance so you can actually have a debate about it. They'll only do that if it's Colin McCarthy and they want to cut everything in the budget. Then they'll publish his report 6 months in advance, use it to soften up the public, and then do some of, not all of it, but just the least worst bits of it. They wouldn't adopt. That's the idea of the climate change one, although it's a bit crude saying it's like Colin McCarthy, but that's the logic, and they didn't buy into it. Certainly the civil service didn't. It was quite good in parliamentary accountability, and that's kind of the main thing. All of the government drafts have been okay on is parliamentary accountability, and we have people in our coalitions going, is it worth it? At what point do we say this game isn't worth the candle after 7 years, that this bill isn't worth passing? I have to say, maybe it's the pragmatist in me, or it's the 7 years of not wanting 7 years of my life to be wasted. I think that actually, even a bad bill, and the bill has got a bit better, I'll come on to it in a minute, but even that much is better than nothing, because, I'm going to give you this example. When John Gormley became Minister for the Environment, he instigated what he called an annual carbon budget. It wasn't a carbon budget as we would understand it in terms of being a set number and you work from there. It was essentially an annual statement to the Dáil as part of the fiscal budget by him, which talked about how far we'd got, what our progress was, what our challenges were, where we were out of sync and so on. So it was a good exercise in parliamentary accountability. And in fact, they insisted that the Minister for Finance, in his fiscal budget speech, so the most listened to speech in the Dáil every year, would have to have a line saying what our carbon emissions have been in the previous year. So it was progress. They didn't get the law passed, so it didn't become enshrined in law, and the new government dropped it immediately. So you no longer have the Minister for Finance mention carbon emissions in his budget speech, and you no longer have any definite statement from the Minister for the Environment or any other minister on our progress in climate change to Parliament in any year, nor any guarantee that any committee will have him in or her in to talk about it in the course of the Parliament. So even if that was the only thing the law did, it would be an advance on where we are now. It would hardwire some element of accountability into our political system. Now, the law will be hopefully better than that. The other thing the law didn't have, which certainly Stop Climate Chaos would push, is it doesn't have any mention of the principle of climate justice. So that was the Green Party Fianna Fáil bill. So it was okay, but not brilliant. It collapsed, as I said. The new government took 2 years to produce a new bill. They were basically trying to, because the other old one got embroiled in the toxicity at the end of the last government, they were kind of waiting for that to pass. They had a public consultation. They took their time. They finally produced a bill that was essentially, after it was supposed to be about bringing all the stakeholders along and so on, it was essentially the same bill with the targets taken out. They took out the 2030 target, they took out the 2050 target, and they said basically, we unequivocally commit to meeting any target that we adopt as part of the European Union or under any other international obligation. But we won't explicitly state what that target is in our own law, and we won't set any concrete objective for 2050. We'll say we want a low carbon, this is kind of the purpose of the Act, low carbon, climate resilient, environmentally sustainable, economy, but we won't say what that means in the Act. They then, though, did this very interesting process with the Oireachtas Committee, which produced a report that we're not happy with all of it. We don't think it's strong enough, but it was a fair representation of the balance of evidence, pretty much fair, or a fair compromise between the 20 people who said we should be much stronger and IBEC and the IFA who said we shouldn't be much stronger. But it was a fair reading of the evidence. It did say, okay, we're not going to have targets, but have a national objective for 2050. Make your committee much more like the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, so properly independent, with independent experts, not with state officials in the majority, which is the worst thing about the government bill, the new government bill. It made the committee worse. It had a majority of people from state agencies who would not be independent, able to give independent advice. The other thing is that the government bill had 7 years for each action plan, which is so long it's likely the government won't be there anymore. So the committee recommended it be reduced from 7 to 5. And the committee recommended that climate justice be put in as one of the principles that ministers had to consider when they were doing their national action plans. That was last November. They brought out their new bill in April. There's still no national objective, but they did a sort of interesting fudge on it. I'll come back in a second. They haven't used they claim they've used the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council as their model, but they haven't. They have just expanded the committee to include 2 new, more independent people. So it's now majority independent again, but it still has 4 ex officio, including Teagasc, which is the research arm of the IFA. Happy to say that on camera. They do good work as well. But they are certainly not going, I know this from practice, they're not going to, it'd be very hard for the director of Teagasc to stand over advice that was tough to government about our choices when it came to agriculture or any other sector. Because if they could improve that at least by putting in, like the Fiscal Advisory Council has, a line in the bill that says the committee or the council or the advisory council shall be independent in the exercise of its functions. The Fiscal Advisory Council is a permanent body corporate with seal and can be sued. This one isn't, so even if you don't get that, at least that line would mean that the director of Teagasc could say to his constituents and his board, I cannot report to you, you cannot hold me accountable for what I say and do or what the council says and does, because we are legally independent in the exercise of our functions. And I think that shouldn't happen anyway. It says in my bio I was on the Royal Irish Academy Climate Change Sciences Committee, which is an academic committee, but has a function in advising government. All of the ex officio members are the members who were there on behalf of institutions. So no, we couldn't be saying that because Met Éireann wouldn't say that. Well, no, you're not Met Éireann now, though. You're the Royal Irish Academy Climate Change Sciences Committee. But yes, still, there was a huge reluctance by people to step outside. And that's what coalitions are for, to a large extent, to allow you to say things you wouldn't necessarily be able to say as an individual body. And if that's what was the case in a relatively sedate academic, apart from when Richard Tall was there, a relatively sedate academic committee, you can imagine when the stakes are high in a high-profile advisory body to government, if they don't have independence, legal independence, they will not be able to produce the hard-hitting advice and the hard-hitting monitoring reports that we need to actually keep action running. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'll draw to a close shortly. So that's really where I touch on that now because it's where it's one of the places where the real battle will be during the Dáil debates, just whether we can get that committee strengthened. They did improve I said that I think from 7 years to 5 years, and the committee said put climate justice in, but it's not in the bill. So it's more like they slightly improved the committee, the council, the advisory council. They slightly improved the timelines. They felt they couldn't ignore the consensus of the committee about what 2050 should be. So they had articulated a really good objective themselves, that's the minister and the officials, which was near zero emissions in energy, buildings and transport, and carbon neutrality, which just means anything you pollute you have to draw back down through your forests and your bogs. Carbon neutrality in agriculture and land use. We said put it in the bill, the committee said put it in the bill, or at least use it as the definition of low carbon. And they didn't do that in the bill, but they then produced, out of the blue, they weren't planning to do a 3-page, here's our new national climate policy document, which wasn't being planned, and lo and behold, that's where it is, right? So a document that had wasn't planned to exist, and has no status beyond this minister, certainly beyond this parliament. It could easily die. But it's there, so we need now to get it from there into the bill in the next phase. So what happens now? Maybe I'll skip the politics, just first of all tell you what happens next. The parliamentary draftsperson's office drafts the full bill. It's not much drafting to do, it's all done in the heads really. And hopefully at least goes to Cabinet and gets it published before the summer recess, because otherwise it's a very tough task to get it done in the autumn session of Parliament. Although in Ireland as many people have remarked, although this is, we do legislation in two ways. One is emergency, overnight, 24 hours, all stages, nobody goes to bed, and we do it that way, and then we regret at leisure when we realise that we'll guarantee the banks, or whatever it might be. Or we take forever. And this is one of the ones where we take forever. We very rarely do it in a properly deliberative but timely manner. But if we want to get it done by the end of the year, it would be much better to get it published before the summer break, and then it can go into the Dáil in September and get done before they go to Lima at the end of November, which is where the UN talks are. So that's still a possibility, although, to just briefly refer to Phil Hogan, if the reshuffle will be on the 8th of July, if there's a change of minister before the bill goes to Cabinet, it's almost only going to slow that down, unfortunately. So it's hard, I hate to say this, but it's hard to see it being published, never mind debated in the Dáil, which could be possible before July. But anyway, 2 minutes on the politics of this. I mean, we were trying to mirror what happened in the UK, where you got all parts. I have a very simple approach to campaigning, basically. You get politicians to agree to something, even if they're not entirely sure what it is, because it sounds good and everyone's doing it. And then over the years, you try to hold them to it. And now, obviously, usually that's in the case of our overseas aid, as we've been touching on. Bertie Ahern in 2000 famously went to the UN Millennium Development Goals Summit and out of the blue said, we're going to reach 0.7% of gross national product in overseas aid by 2007. And we still don't know where he got the 2007 from, except we think it might be because it rhymes, or whatever the word is. 0.7 in 2007. I swear to God, that's the best explanation anyone's come up with as to what that year was chosen. We still haven't got there, but for a while it was, even though we didn't quite get there, it was a really useful leverage on government. I mean, you get them to promise something and then you try to keep them to the promise. Obviously putting it into law is a much bigger deal, but that's the basic idea. And all party is really important, because it's been really important in the UK that Cameron and co voted the climate change bill. And so when it came to the crunch, he hasn't been able to walk away from it. I mean, they've had the opportunity to throw out their fourth carbon budget, which is for the years up to 2030 and beyond. And in the end, and this is actually probably more useful than our politics, but the departments broke down, not by party, but the business department, which is Lib Dem, and the Treasury, which is Conservative, said, scrap it, don't do it, we want to have more business and less carbon reduction, for the sake of argument. That's how they did it. Obviously, Climate Change and Energy Department said, no, we have to do it. And interestingly, William Hague, that's Lib Dem, William Hague, Foreign Secretary, said, we have to do it because climate change progress, being progressive on climate change, is now part of the UK's international image and how we present ourselves on the world stage. We cannot back away from it. And in the end, Cameron came down on the side of Hague and Chris Huhne, and they adopted the fourth carbon budget. Ibeck here said we couldn't have an independent committee in Ireland because you'd end up with the sort of public scraps about climate policy that they had in the UK over the fourth carbon budget, and that would be just awful. No, that's democracy. That's the point. Having a public debate on the trade-offs involved in our climate policy is exactly what the climate change law is designed to have. Because when it happens in back rooms, no longer smoky back rooms, that's when that's what happens. You can be damn sure you then don't get a progressive outcome. You get an outcome where hopefully no one will notice that we've just missed our targets again. Whereas if they're in law, it's more difficult to get away with that. And if you want to know, the very basics of the politics, when the Green Party Fianna Fáil bill came out in 2010, the progressive alliances that were looking for legislation were kind of, okay, yeah, cautious welcome, but here is our criticisms of it. It needs to be strengthened. It's not still the UK bill, which was at the time only / gold standard. And Ibeck and the IFA were furious. And I've been 20 years in campaigning. We went away on our Christmas holidays having received the bill. And I haven't recovered yet from the month-long onslaught of the IFA after Christmas. They obviously didn't take Christmas holidays, and they went through the bill and they went through Parliament like I don't know, whatever the phrase is, in that month of January. And even if the government hadn't collapsed, it's not clear that they that Fianna Fáil would have been able to get it through the Shannon because of the pressure on their senators from the IFA. All those close to the bill say it was the IFA had been indifferent to it until then. They didn't think it was any threat to them because it was about 2050, and they knew they were powerful enough anyway to stop any their cuts in their sector. But Ibeck, who were worried about it, got the IFA worried, and the IFA were much better able than Ibeck was to scupper it. Now, we don't know if they would have scuppered it because the government collapsed. But when the new bill came out in 2013, it was immediately welcomed by the IFA and Ibeck as being sensible, and it was lambasted by all of those of us who've been campaigning for a progressive legislation. We've brought it back a bit. The new draft is better, and it's still better than nothing. But there is now, hopefully in the next 6 months, one last opportunity to engage our own TDs now to try to improve it as it goes through Parliament. And still try to get all parties to support it, because I think that's very important, so that they all feel ownership of it when it comes to actually implementing it.